I usually focus on what our movements can do, how we're moving forward. It's a little harder for me to take this one on, which is to focus on what stands in our way. But it is important that we get that. And so I'm going to do my best to talk about sort of some of the problems that we face in the anti-nuclear movement. I would say maybe the biggest problem we have is acronyms. I've got to say the acronyms of the anti-nuclear world and the nuclear world are the worst of all of them. So just saying that it makes it a little harder to understand sometimes for folks who are not experts in this, what exactly we're talking about. I was going to start with a bit on the challenges that we face regarding global nuclear policy. There's a serious weakness in the multilateral world in terms of what nuclear policy looks like. There's so much focus on non-proliferation instead of disarmament. The new UN treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons is a huge victory on the one hand, but we haven't yet figured out how to really force it onto the PERM 5, particularly the United States, where the bulk of the problem of nuclear proliferation and nuclear power, nuclear weapons lies. The role of nuclear weapons in determining which countries can call themselves a global power remains serious. The part of the reason that the UK and France remain on the Security Council as permanent members partly goes back to history. It goes back to their role in World War II. This was very definitely the victors of the war establishing the veto and the permanent members of the Security Council. But it also goes to the fact that they happen to be part of the Nuke 5. And that coalescence between nuclear power and the ability to engage as a global superpower represents, I think, a serious barrier for us. But coming to the question of the US policy side, which is, of course, the more important part for our work here, I think that there's a similar issue in terms of how persistently the US continues to ignore its obligations under international law. We're all familiar with Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that calls for moving towards general and complete nuclear disarmament. But when you talk to anyone in the State Department and virtually all but really a few of our heroic members of Congress, they laugh at that. They laugh at that. They are very upfront that they have no intention of moving towards disarmament. And the fact that there's a willingness to pay $1 trillion for what is called modernization and to pay $40 to $50 billion a year for the nuclear arsenal shows us that. It shows us what the priorities are. We have to be careful, I think, when we talk about how no first use is simply not sufficient. That's absolutely true. And it's absolutely true that we don't even have that accomplished yet. So we have to be very clear about how far it is that we have to go. We are far from achieving what should be the floor. It should be the floor to start with no first use and then move quickly towards nuclear abolition. But we're not at that floor. We have no floor yet on the question of controlling nuclear weapons. Martin Luther King taught us that budgets are moral documents. And when we look at the budget of the United States, when we look at the military budget, when we look at the $40 billion to $50 billion every year that we spend in nuclear weapons, not even included in the military budget officially, it's in the energy budget, we have to be very sanguine about what lies ahead and how difficult it is. I did put in the chat, for those of you who hadn't seen it, some of the trade-offs from the national priorities that Bill referenced about what 40 billion could also pay for in terms of healthcare for kids and education and jobs and all the things that we are told we can't afford because we are spending 53 cents of every federal dollar on the military. We're spending another 40 billion or more on the nuclear arsenal. And that's why they say we can't provide for, we can't pay for, we can't fund a Green New Deal, Medicare for all the things that we want and need in this country. So this lack of political will and the economic distortion towards militarism and nuclear weapons is a huge barrier to our work that makes it much more difficult. We also face challenges as a movement. Like the broader anti-war movement, the anti-nuclear movement, has to respond to very different political circumstances than the era in which it was created. First in the 50s, in the immediate post-war period, then revival in the late 60s and 70s, and then in the 80s with the Freeze movement. In each of these periods, we've had to change and adjust to changing political circumstances. And we have to do that now, including a growing level of attention being paid to who pays the price, who is losing when we pay $40 billion a year to pay for nuclear weapons. With the end of the Cold War, anti-nuclear movements around the world faded to a large degree. And it was a hardcore of the stalwarts of the anti-nuclear movement that stood fast and continued their work. But the broader movement faded as the conflict between superpowers seemed to fade away. The rise of the global war on terror in the post 9/11 period led to a sense among many, I think, that nuclear competition and the competition between global military powers at the state level was really off the agenda. The US was going to war in a new kind of war against impoverished nations and against non-state actors all around the world, so that the need for a nuclear specific anti-war movement seemed to fade. And part of the problem was we didn't link it carefully enough and strongly enough to the broader progressive demands and the progressive movement that it needs to be a part of. So we have this challenge of engaging in these broader movements, many of them led by people of color, the movements that Shally was just talking about, the movements of poor people, the movements for jobs and healthcare and childcare and all the things that are missing in this country that are not available because of the cost of war and the cost of nuclear weapons. We need to make those links sharper so that the question of opposing nuclear weapons and opposing paying for nuclear weapons becomes something that everybody takes up. We need to understand also, we need an inside and outside strategy, but we need to understand the difference between what we are calling for as a movement and what we will still support in Congress. And there's sometimes a contradiction between them. We have to keep the focus on abolition. Anybody who's worked in this movement and has ever talked, for example, to Peter Weiss and any of the greats of our movement know that you cannot talk about reducing nuclear weapons. It must be abolition. At the same time, we need to be prepared to support anyone in Congress who's moving towards any diminution of nuclear weapons in the arsenal, even if it's a partial, small thing. We need to do both. We need to do an inside and outside strategy. And finally, I think when we come to this question of what's possible, the new resolution now in Congress, the Foreign Policy for the 21st Century, that was been introduced by Barbara Lee and Pramila Jayapal. I think we'll be hearing about it later from Barbara Lee when she speaks. We have a huge challenge on that because we don't have enough members of Congress who feel that they must sign it because our movements will hold them accountable if they don't. That's why we need to strengthen our movement. That new foreign policy includes important language on the threat of nuclear weapons, and we need to be supporting it. That means we need to support the entire thing. And it goes back to this notion of we can't focus only on nuclear weapons. We have to put nuclear weapons squarely into the central piece of every other movement, whether it's the environmental justice movement, immigrant rights movement, the women's movement, the LGBT movement, the labor movement, the anti-racist movement. All of these movements are paying a price for nuclear weapons, and we have to be the ones to say, you need to be there with us, and we are here with you to make sure that all of us together can stop nuclear weapons. Thank you.